Was I wrong for what I did? Tell me if you would have done the same thing. The first time I watched her cry in front of everyone, fake, crocodile tears and hands fluttering like a wounded bird, I felt nothing but the cold, satisfied click of a lock shutting. People called her Aunty with syrupy respect. She called me child when she wanted to condescend, and she called me everything else when she thought I wouldn't hear. She built her life on other people's pain, on petty cruelties that look tiny from the outside, but are like nails hammered into someone's skull day after day. She made jokes about my job, whispered about my partner's ambitions, forced her opinions into every family dinner until I stopped going. She stole chances from my little brother, bullied my mother into doubting herself, and when the only person left to pick on was me, she smiled an smile and shoved a knife in my back. I could have walked away. I could have smiled and played the game. Instead, I decided to destroy her, not with punches or fire, but with the sort of quiet, surgical ruin only the patient and precise can execute. Hear me out, you'll either think I'm monstrous, or you'll think I finally did what everyone else only whispered about. The story doesn't begin with a dramatic betrayal or a ransacked house. It begins with a cup of tea and a laugh that landed like a slap. Aunty, her real name was Sarwat, but Aunty, made her authority official, had been part of our lives as long as I remember. At family events, she sat at the head of the table, draped in jewelry that glittered like someone else's achievement. She had this way of leaning into conversations, and then leaning out with a line that left people thinking they were wrong for even having an opinion. She loved being the center, and she loved making others small. My first clear memory of her cruelty was subtle, a story she told about my first job interview, retold like a parable at a cousin's engagement, where she made me sound like a desperate, incompetent mess. People laughed and patted my shoulder. I sat there, cheeks burning, and nodded because confronting her in public would have made me the villain. Over the years, those stories multiplied, little anecdotes twisted into character assassinations. She would pass off my hard work as luck, my successes as flukes, and my earnest attempts to stand up for myself as something to be pitied. My partner began to pull away because Aunty whispered that I was ambitious in a dangerous way. My mother learned to doubt her own judgment because Aunty always had a quieter, more reasonable opinion when my mother was being too proud or too brash. What pushed me over the edge wasn't one big transgression. It was the accumulation, the small cruelties that make a life heavy. The way she took credit for charity drives she barely attended, the way she patronized my mother's cooking at family functions, but then bragged about how progressive she was to friends. It was the day she turned my brother against our father during an argument about the farm. The whispered insinuations that led to our father's temper flaring, and the long nights we spent trying to stitch relationships back together. It was jealousy in lipstick and chiffon, disguised as concern. She did all of this in 1,000 elegant, plausible ways. No single person could point to a moment and say, that woman ruined us, but everyone felt the damage. And when the damage included my heart, when she treated my love like a rumor and called my partner a gold digger in the softest possible voice, I realized there was no neutral path left. Neutral had been consumed by her. I started small, like a surgeon testing anesthesia. Revenge in fiction loves theatrics, burning houses, public meltdowns, blood on marble. Real revenge rarely shouts. It waits, it watches, and it picks the right moment to make a revelation. I watched her the way you watch patterns in the weather. I listened to the stories she told, the lies she told, and the truths she hid. I mapped her allies and her instruments, cousins who adored her for the table, cloth gossip, colleagues who feared her opinions, neighbors who thought her piety meant moral superiority. She had a little network of people who did her emotional labor, people who would do her bidding because she had convinced them their benefit was tied to her favor. That tied me to the only weapon I had, people. The first real move was entirely psychological, an opening salvo that cost me nothing but hairline patience. I started planting seeds in conversation, tiny and casual. I praised the wrong people where she could hear. I praised people she ignored. When she used a name to belittle me, I used it back softly, almost as a joke, and watched as she searched for the edge in my voice. People began to notice that I no longer flinched. This alone unsettled her. She liked the idea of me as malleable, a piece she could bend. My composure was a small, poisonous blow. From there, things escalated into the social theater I planned. I began to compile everything she had done, not like a detective hunting for crimes, more like a librarian making a catalog of wrongs. I kept notes, dates, words, incidents. I recorded the way she humiliated Aunt Farah in front of the PTA, the way she undermined my boss's project and later took credit for a fix, the way she drained our father's patience until he refused to speak to us for weeks. I recorded with a purpose, not to expose every petty slight, but to find the thread that tied them into something undeniable. She was clever, the thread ran through money. Always money borrowed and never repaid. Favors that became forced gratitude, a hand in every pie. The woman was a networker who fed on other people's wallets and reputations. In parallel, I started being useful in public ways. I volunteered for the causes she liked, but I did the quiet, hard work. I showed up at school fundraisers she could only attend for a photo op. I organized a clothing drive and ensured it was done with humility, thanking every volunteer. The community started to talk about me with the same affection she had enjoyed. That was the first real fracture. People who had been conditioned to romanticize Auntie's gestures began to see someone else, someone who did things without a camera. Once people tasted authenticity, the script started to change. The next level was more deliberate. I cultivated allies. I reached out to those she had bruised and didn't realize it. Sometimes they were reluctant because these things were complicated, messy, and not black and white. But honesty, offered at the right moment, is catalytic. I started by helping a neighbor whom she had publicly embarrassed over a gardening dispute. The neighbor's gratitude morphed into trust, and soon she was sharing private jokes about how Auntie always needed to be at the center. I listened without judgment. I let people talk. The stories multiplied, and one by one, the small pains that had once been shrugged off became a chorus. There was one person in particular who shifted everything, my cousin, Hina. She had been under Auntie's sway for years, engaged in late-night phone calls that ended with tears and rebukes. Hina had been the perfect engine of Auntie's influence, always repeating her phrases at weddings and adopting her fashion. Breaking that relationship was the psychological equivalent of cutting power to a building. I didn't try to convince Hina. I showed her. I invited her for tea, listened to the ways Auntie had subtly undermined her marriage, and I reflected her own worth back to her with such clarity she couldn't deny it. That moment simple, sisterly flipped Hina. She started to doubt Auntie. When Hina doubted, other windows opened. Another cousin noticed the contradictions in Auntie's charity. A business partner began to question the favors Auntie had procured. Once the first cracks formed, they spread faster than I expected. The thing about people who build power on gossip and manipulation is that their house often sits on shaky ground. Pull one post and the whole thing leans. But doubt alone does not destroy a person. For that, you need exposure. I needed to take the chorus of grievances and convert them into a single, undeniable truth that everyone would accept. She was not benevolent. She was calculating. I could have gone to the family and aired everything in an explosive confrontation, but I've learned the hard way that humiliation staged in private becomes a legend of martyrdom. If you want someone publicly undone, you must let the world see the evidence on its own terms, so I made the evidence inevitable. I started with things I could show: documents, receipts, photos not to teach, but to demonstrate. I found a ledger of donations she had claimed to make but never had, receipts with names that didn't match, and messages where she negotiated favors with a ruthlessness that made my stomach turn. Again, I avoided anything illegal. I didn't forge, I didn't hack. I simply collected what people had left in plain sight and what they'd confessed in sleepy, drunken honesty to friends. Secrets are like leaves in wind, some of them settle at your feet if you stand still long enough. Then came the social math, timing, placement, cadence. Auntie loved events where she could hold court. She loved charity lunches that read like a runway for virtue. I decided to let her virtue parade be the stage for her downfall. The plan was to make the reveal happen where her power was strongest, in public, surrounded by the very people who mistook her for goodness. But I couldn't make it look like a setup. I needed it to look like accidental truth, like a coincidence the universe couldn't resist. On the day of the big charity luncheon, an event she had been promoting like a general before a battle, I arrived with a calm face and a subtle arsenal. I didn't storm in with a microphone. Instead, I arranged for small, natural conversations to occur around her. I let Hina sit near the organizer and ask the right questions, casual, curious questions about where the funds were sourced and which donors had been thanked. The organizer, overwhelmed and sincere, mentioned a list of big donors' names that matched nothing on Auntie's supposed contributions. People glanced away, awkward. My stomach hummed. Then, as the luncheon moved to a silent auction Auntie had insisted on sponsoring, someone asked about the vouchers for the auction items. An honest volunteer who had once been embarrassed by Auntie's slights spoke up and said, actually, those were donated by a few community businesses who wanted to help, not by Auntie. The table shifted, Auntie's smile thinned. These were small exposures, a mismatch here, an untruth there. But cluster them together, and a pattern emerges. That pattern is what destroys people built on image. The room's atmosphere went from celebratory to uncomfortable, and Auntie, reigned to command the room, seemed to lose her script. Her laughter became too loud, her hands too busy. She tried to steer conversations to other topics, to the color of the napkins, to the efficiency of the volunteers. But once trust fractures publicly, it spreads like mercury. The most decisive moment came later that day, when an elderly woman from the neighborhood someone Auntie had publicly mentored, stood and told a small, trembling story. She talked about how Auntie had remarked that the woman's son was lazy and ungrateful, and how that remark had led to years of shame. The woman's voice wobbled, and for a second she didn't know she was in the midst of confession. The room fell silent. People started matching these small testimonies to their own memories. The soft murmur built into a low hum of recognition. In that silence, the truth wasn't shouted. It simply existed. People looked at Auntie differently. After the luncheon, things accelerated beyond what I had dared hope. Auntie began to lose her hold in places that had once been hers. The PTA asked her not to chair a committee. Her charity invites dwindled. The cousin she'd always flattered now declined social calls. She tried the old tricks, angry calls, passive-aggressive posts, crying to certain friends. But the network had shifted. Trust is cumulative. Once people believe your actions will reward them, they'll keep you. Once they think your actions harm them, they will protect themselves. The protection network rose like a wall around my targets and left Auntie exposed. I wish I could say it was clean. It was not. She struck back in ways that were petty and poisonous. She spread rumors about me, about my job, about my partner, about supposed debts I owed. She tried to paint herself as the victim of a cruel, ungrateful child. People who didn't know what had happened believed her for a while. That was the hardest part, watching people you had protected for years hesitate because of a few, well-laced tears. But each smear she launched only reinforced the truth for those who had seen her for years. Her temper, once charming, looked like volatility. Her tears, once claimed as suffering, now looked like performance. There was one blow she attempted that nearly undid everything. She tried to sabotage my job. She called my manager and implied that I had acted unprofessionally at a volunteer event. It took every ally I had built, quiet testimonials, documented messages, the memory of my consistent presence, to counter that. My manager confronted me privately, not angrily but bewildered. I gave him the ledger of my actions, the names of people who could vouch for me. He scanned it, said nothing, and later that week told Auntie that her allegations were baseless. When someone in power sees evidence, rumors wither. The aftermath of all this was messy and wide. Auntie's fall didn't look like a dramatic collapse. It looked like a series of missed invitations, a dwindling social calendar, and the slow evaporation of favors. But she was not defeated entirely. People who owed her things, small, petty debts of affection, still listened. She still had someone who would buy her a coffee and laugh at her stories. But the robust ecosystem-wide power she had amassed was gone. She no longer dominated conversations. She existed on the margins of them. Her reputation, once a glossy veneer, now had cracks. When she walked into a room, heads no longer turned in unison. Some people stared, some looked away, and some, to her greatest horror, treated her like a human with flaws. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant forever. For a little while, I felt an adrenaline-laced satisfaction that hummed through my bones. It was not glee exactly, but a deep, righteous calm. The first time I saw her in public after the luncheon, she tripped on the edge of a step and then laughed it off, like someone performing a joke for the audience to prove she was fine. In those small moments, I could see the person beneath the performance tired, feral, and bewildered. And I felt a complicated relief. I had not used violence, I had not destroyed her physically, I had used what she used, social capital, and returned it to the people she had taken from. That feels like justice to me. Now listen, before I tell you how it all ends, I want you to pause and imagine yourself in my shoes. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have walked away? Would you have confronted her directly? Would you have done exactly what I did? I'm serious. Stop the video, type your answer, then come back. This is the point where people usually split into two camps. Those who believe revenge is never justified, and those who think karma doesn't move fast enough without a little nudge. Which camp are you in? Back again, good. Because the climax wasn't a single moment of retribution. It was the slow, inexorable rearrangement of loyalties. The final scene that mattered to me came not with a bang, but with a question. Months after the luncheon, Aunty attempted one last grand gesture. She announced a big family celebration, promising reconciliation and healing for those she'd hurt. It was either audacity or desperation, the sort of grand show she thought would re-establish her throne. I could have avoided it, but I went. I wanted to see if she would truly change. She didn't. She arrived like a queen expecting worship and found instead a room full of people who understood the cost of her generosity. There were stiff smiles, polite clapping, and a general air of caution. She made a speech about family and unity, and in her voice I heard the rehearsed cadence of someone who had never truly listened to anyone but herself. People clapped because that's what you do at speeches. But the real thing happened afterward in whispers. The cousin she'd always leaned on came up to her, and in a voice that trembled with won courage, said, "Aunty, we're tired of being objects in your stories. If you want us back, it won't be..." With lies, the family didn't erupt. They simply looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. That look was more destructive than any shouted accusation could have been. Her control broke like a glass dropped from a table, no dramatic shatter, just the sudden, irreparable fissure. After that, life settled into a new normal. Aunty continued to exist. She still had a home, she still wore her jewelry, she still tried to sway people with sweetness, but she lacked the authority she'd used to direct others' lives. More importantly, the people she'd harmed found small recoveries. My mother spoke up more freely. My brother reclaimed his decisions. Hina laughed with me without that nervous tension she used to carry. The humiliation I feared I might one day feel at my hands had never come. Instead, there was a tempered peace. I don't tell this story to brag. I tell it because it mattered, and because I want to be honest about how it felt. Revenge, even the carefully plotted kind, leaves marks. The person who plotted it learns how to watch others like maps, to see people's fears and hopes as points to be moved. You gain clarity and you lose some innocence. You also learn that not every battle is worth fighting. I destroyed Aunty in the ways that hurt most, her illusions and her dominion. I did not take her life, her home, or her ability to speak. I took her myth. There is a cruelty to that. I won't deny it. But there is also mercy. Without the myth, she had to live with herself, and perhaps that is the worst punishment for someone who thrived on being a legend. If you're still with me, here's what I want you to remember. Power that depends on other people's shame is fragile. Reputation is a house of cards when it's built on gossip and small cruelties. And if you are the one being quietly picked apart by someone who smiles at your face while kicking the table under you, know that there are ways to respond that don't reduce you to their level. You can stand steady, gather evidence of goodness around you, and let the truth become visible. It will take time. It will be messy, but truth has a way of asserting itself when enough people choose it, like this video if you were on my side. Subscribe for more stories like this. Stories of betrayal, grit, and the kind of justice real life sometimes needs. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Was I right to destroy her social power? Would you have done something differently? I read every comment, and I want to hear your take. If you or someone you know is dealing with a manipulative family member, say something, reach out to someone. You don't have to carry it alone. I'll see you all in the next story.